These are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. My name is Margaret Burns, and for most of you who have attended our webinars before, you know that normally our wonderful Tim Fortier runs these webinars, but this afternoon I am pinch hitting for Tim, and hopefully we'll have a smooth webinar for you on the topic of drones. Here with us today to talk about drones is Chris Hawkins from the law firm of Devine Millimet. Hi, Chris. How are you?
I'm doing very well, Margaret. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here. Just as a few matters of housekeeping for you, you should see up on the screen the PowerPoint presentation. You should also see on the screen a panel on the right-hand side of the screen. You can hide it by hitting the orange arrow there. You can also bring it back by hitting the orange arrow there. There is an opportunity for you to type in your questions as well on that panel on the right-hand side, and we welcome your questions. We will do our best to take those questions throughout when we have a moment for a break to answer some of the questions that you put up there on the screen. Other than that, I would just go ahead and turn it over to Chris for our webinar today. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you, everybody, for attending, and good afternoon. As Margaret said, my name is Chris Hawkins. I'm an attorney with Devine Millimet branch in Manchester. I'm also the town moderator, school district moderator, and chair of the Zoning Board of Adjustment in the town of Newmarket, and have held several other positions there. So I have a pretty good understanding of some of the challenges that we all face with our cities and towns. So I got interested in the topic of drones a couple of years ago. I work a great deal with engineering firms, surveyors, design professionals who were very interested in this technology. The FAA loosened up their rules last year to allow increased or easier access for commercial use of drones, which brought a lot of these issues to the forefront. And I've presented, I think this is my third or fourth seminar now, and I've published several articles, including in the most recent issue of City and Town on this issue. So the first thing I learned when I got into this topic is that there's a lot of questions and not a lot of answers at this point. Happy to field questions as best I can, and we'll just move ahead. So basically what I'm going to talk about today is what you see on the screen is talk about briefly what is a drone, what the federal government refers to as an unmanned aircraft system, or a UAS. The FAA is trying to get away from the use of the term drone because it has unfortunate military overtones. So we're going to talk about what it is, what are they used for, what are the risks and benefits of using one, and in order to focus on issues that I think will be of specific concern for our municipal officials, what is the jurisdiction of airspace and the interaction between federal, state, and local jurisdiction, what the current New Hampshire law is that relates to the use of these systems, and talk a little bit about what I believe the future holds with respect to this technology. So as you can see, the federal government defines a drone, a UAS, as an unmanned aircraft and its associated elements. That includes the controller and any other portions of the system that's used to operate the aircraft. It encompasses the vehicle itself and the ground control function. This photograph just shows you some examples of what these things look like. They can closely resemble helicopters. They can have anywhere from 2 to 4 to 8 propellers. Typically, when we're talking about recreational or ordinary commercial uses of these things, they generally weigh less than 55 pounds, but 55 pounds is quite a large object to fly through the air. There are fixed-wing versions of these things as well. What are they used for at this point in time? They can be used for law enforcement purposes, search and rescue, inspection of bridges, power lines, pipelines, cell towers, that kinds of things, those kinds of things. There are YouTube videos showing how power line inspections are done currently. You basically have a helicopter with a platform with a person sitting on it wearing what amounts to a chainmail suit, and they fly very close along power lines to inspect them for any problems. That's extremely dangerous work. So the use of drone technology to replace that very dangerous work is obviously attractive. They're used for surveying, obviously hobby and recreation purposes. Aerial photography and filmmaking is a very big issue, a very big use of them. There was an article in the Conway Daily Sun just a couple of days ago on this issue of many local businesses popping up in the Mount Washington Valley, wedding photographers, in particular, making use of this technology to enhance the experience for their customers. Construction oversight for planning and zoning purposes, of course, product delivery is a use that's being looked at.
Chris, we do have a question here. You were just talking about some of the purposes for which they can be used. This individual asks, can the UAS be used for tax assessment purposes? And I would just add on to that, are you seeing that being used for that purpose?
I haven't personally seen them used for tax assessment purposes. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the limitations that may exist on the use of these things, but I guess not as a formal legal opinion, but if you can take a view of a property from the public street, why shouldn't you be able to take the same view using a drone? That's the position I would sort of take. And that gets us immediately into the question of privacy and what it means and how it applies, and we'll talk about that in more detail.
Great.
This is just an example of it. This is not the New Hampshire Municipal Association headquarters. This is in fact the Taj Mahal, and you can see you can buy a drone for $100 or less and produce this kind of an image, which can have a great deal of power. This is Barcelona, Spain, just another example of the kind of image, very powerful and fascinating image that you can produce using these things, very inexpensively and accessible to all kinds of people. So we talked about some of the uses that can be made of these things. They're generally equipped these days, even relatively inexpensive drones, with high-definition cameras. Many of them can record in real time. They can download real-time images to your phone or your iPad. They're much safer. They can accomplish tasks less expensively and with reduced or no risk of personal injury. Say if you're going to do a bridge inspection, you have to set up scaffolding. You need to have traffic control monitoring the road. You have to have all of your safety tie-offs and everything in place. It can take several hours. It can be expensive. Or you can have a drone with a high-definition camera. You can program it to fly a predetermined flight path. One person can do it, and it can be over in 20 minutes or a half hour, and the same work can be accomplished with no risk. There are businesses in the state that can equip these things with different kinds of payloads, infrared cameras with LiDAR for mapping ground contours, to facilitate surveying, and all kinds of other uses can be made of these things. And of course, there's always a flip side. The accessibility of them and the ease in which they can be used creates all kinds of risk, or highlights risks for invasions of privacy, trespass, personal injury, and property damage. One of the, obviously, the huge concerns of the FAA is people operating these things in the vicinity of manned aircraft. There are concerns with security for people flying drones into prisons and correctional facilities to deliver illicit goods, flying these things over pieces of critical infrastructure for unknown purposes. So there's significant risks as well that are posed by these things. One of the issues that this raises is exactly what is privacy? You know, what are our expectations of what are the appropriate limits of privacy in this day and age, where we give away voluntarily a lot of our rights to privacy? We sign them over to Google, or Amazon or Facebook without giving it a second thought. And also, when you stop and think about it, there are many, many activities that we all undertake in our day that are open to public view, just walking down the street or working in your yard. People can be in a public place where they're perfectly entitled to be and observe a lot of our activities through the day. So these are the kind of challenges that are raised by drones. Why are drones different than somebody using a telephoto lens from across the street, say? I believe that drones are just creepier, and I don't think it's more scientific than that, because they can, in principle, fly directly up to your window and see into your bedroom and other parts of your life that you ordinarily would consider to be private. They can also be used by law enforcement to monitor crowds or follow suspects, and in principle, they can be armed. I was talking to Margaret beforehand. There's a YouTube video out there which you can Google, you can search for in YouTube. There's a young man in Connecticut who has weaponized a couple of drones. He's armed one with a flamethrower and one with an automatic weapon. He's a 20-something-year-old former engineering student. I think the YouTube video is something like roasting the Thanksgiving turkey. I think if you
with
YouTube
the drone?
that, with the drone, armed with a flamethrower. So that's obviously a major issue. So that's just an overview of some of the opportunities and some of the risks that are posed by these things. I know one of my surveyor clients is using these things now to do topographic mapping using digital images and loading the images into software that automatically is able to triangulate and piece together several of the images and create ground contours. Can do this in a matter of minutes rather than a matter of days and at much less cost to the customer. So the jurisdiction of airspace, for a long time, the limits of the jurisdiction of airspace wasn't really a big issue unless you were trying to construct a building in the vicinity of an airport. It just wasn't an issue that came up on radar screens very often. There simply wasn't a reason to draw very clear and bright lines because aircraft were operated by licensed pilots who were familiar with the rules of airspace, and aircraft generally were not operated within 400 or 500 feet of the ground. As well as being illegal, there's no reason to do that unless you're crop dusting or something. So it just wasn't a big issue until drones came into the marketplace. So how is airspace defined? In the days before flight was possible, before commercial flight certainly was possible, the old rule, the old judge-made common law rule, was that ownership of land extended from the center of the earth under your property to the periphery of the universe. There was a giant cone that went all that way. And with that theory in place, any overflight of your property at whatever altitude technically would constitute a trespass. Now, clearly that doesn't make any sense anymore. It's downright silly, and how the heck could you tell whether an airplane at 30,000 feet was flying over your property anyway? So it was a rule that had no practical impact. Shortly, in around the vicinity of World War II, when practical air travel, commercial air travel became more practically available, Congress and the courts moved to define airspace in a way that was more meaningful. So Congress decided that the U.S. government would have exclusive jurisdiction of the airspace of the United States, and that U.S. citizens would have a right to transit through the navigable airspace of the United States. The courts developed some law through the existing framework of the law of trespass, basically. And that's defined, and the restatement a book that lawyers like me use called the Restatement of Torts. And what that says is a flight by aircraft over land owned by somebody else is a trespass if it enters the immediate reaches of the airspace next to the land and substantially interferes with the property owner's use and enjoyment of the land. So what are the immediate reaches? Yeah. The immediate reaches are, in the restatement anyway, defined basically as within 500 feet. I think the current federal regulation puts it at 400 feet, and it's that area of between the ground level and 400 or 500 feet where there is an overlapping of jurisdiction between between the federal government and state and local regulation of drones. So 50 feet is definitely within the immediate reaches, and 150 feet or in that range is something that's ordinarily a jury would have to decide whether that was within the immediate reaches or not. And that rule of trespass of people intruding into the airspace above your property, classically, and you can see some of the cases here go back into the 1920s, 1940s, 1930s. Not just the aircraft, but also if someone erects a building and the eaves of the building hang over your property, or wires are strung that cross your property even though there's no physical contact with your property, or firing shots over land owned by another, even if none of the shots land on the property, those can all be trespasses. Those can all be considered trespasses in the common law. And we're going to circle back to this issue later, but most cities and towns obviously have zoning regulations that limit the height of structures in certain areas of the town. You can't erect a building over 60 feet or 50 feet or 100 feet, depending on what it is. And that's all based on the classic sort of police power considerations of health and safety and firefighting, and to protect property values. The federal government typically doesn't look to regulate the heights of buildings that intrude into airspace unless, again, you're in the vicinity of an airport. So what this all boils down to is there's an area of overlap between federal, state, and local jurisdiction. For very roughly speaking, and subject to further definition and refinement by the FAA as they continue to develop regulations in this area, let's say for purposes of today that area of overlap exists somewhere between 500 feet, between ground level and 500 feet above the ground. So the federal government is acutely aware that, oops, I'm skipping ahead, that there is a gray area of regulation between the state and local officials and the federal government. They published a fact sheet on December 17th, 2015. I've given Margaret a copy, and maybe she can make it available.
Absolutely.
And I'm happy to send it to anybody who wants to see it. It's a 2 or 3 page document that talks about, in broad terms, what the FAA views as the areas where it's okay for state and local regulators to make regulations that relate to airspace. And here are some of the basic principles that are outlined in the fact sheet. Until very recently, until May of 2017, in fact, a drone that weighed between 150 grams and 25 kilos, that's basically half a pound and 55 pounds, used for recreational purposes, were required to be registered with the FAA. A federal court recently struck down the registration requirement, saying it was beyond the FAA's power to enact that regulation as to recreational users, and a citation to the case is there. So there is currently no registration requirement for recreational use of drones, although people continue to register. And in fact, you can go on the FAA website and see a list of all the drones that have been registered in each city and town in the country. Last time I saw it, it had not been updated since May of 2016, but there are well over 800,000, I think, already registered.
Wow.
With the federal government. A drone used for commercial purposes, though, still has to be registered. And it's important to note that according to the FAA, state and local officials cannot vary the registration requirements without FAA approval. So if registration is not required by the federal government for drones used for recreational purposes, and the state or local government tries to impose a registration requirement for such drones, the FAA is probably going to take the position that that regulation is not enforceable. And we'll talk about what then you should do if you want to make regulation in this area. What the FAA is really trying to avoid is a patchwork quilt situation where regulations vary from town to town and from state to state, which would make it impossible, or effectively impossible, for people to use drones for either recreational or commercial purposes. It would just be too complicated to navigate all the conflicting regulations. The FAA wants to keep navigable airspace free from inconsistent regulations. That's part of their mission. And they can preempt any state or local regulation, even if it's consistent, generally consistent with what they're trying to accomplish, if it creates a significant risk of inconsistent regulation from one place to another. So the first point on this slide is the most important point, possibly. What they want state and local officials to do if they're considering a regulation is to talk to them about it first. Call the FAA, email the FAA, say, this is what we have in mind. What do you think of this?
And Chris, you said that the FAA has been pretty responsive and good to communicate with municipalities on these topics.
Yes, they have been, in my experience. I've sent several questions to a lawyer at the local FAA office, which is in Burlington, Massachusetts, and he's been very responsive. The FAA is trying to figure out the same issues we're talking about here. The FAA is also trying to figure out exactly how to handle a lot of these issues because this is a brave new world of regulation for them. The advent and the widespread availability of these things has created issues that they are still trying to work out. So for folks who are interested, the FAA office, I give the address and the phone number. It's the FAA office, 12 New England Executive Park, Burlington, Massachusetts, 01803. And the phone number there is 781-238-7046.
And I will include that information. We will include that information. We will send you a follow-up email next week that should include this recording as well as other documents like that contact information.
Right. So to give some examples, again, referring to this fact sheet, if you want to pass an ordinance that prevents any use of a drone within the limits of your town, they're going to want to know that, because I think they're probably going to be very skeptical and unwilling to permit that. But they may be very willing to consider a regulation that prohibits the overflight of a drone at less than 400 or 500 feet of any critical infrastructure, such as a school or your sewage plant or your water plant or your police station or your fire station. All that may very well be permissible, but they want to know about it first so that they can understand what you have in mind. If the issue ends up in court, somebody challenges the regulation, courts are going to very strictly scrutinize any state or local attempt to regulate overflights that impact upon the navigable airspace. They're going to look at that as very much within the purview of the federal government to determine, in order to ensure the safety of manned flight, of course. If you have a state or local regulation of specific equipment or imposing specific training requirements for the use of a drone within your town, the FAA is most likely going to prohibit that. So if a town, for example, tries to pass a regulation that anybody who uses a drone within the town must be a licensed pilot, they're probably going to say that's inconsistent with their current state of regulation and would most likely be unenforceable. So we talked a lot about what cities and towns can't do. Let's talk about a little bit of what they can do according to the FAA's fact sheet. They recognize that they don't want to get involved in and have no jurisdiction over or resources or anything to get involved in regulations relating to land use or zoning, privacy, trespass, and local law enforcement operations. Those things are typically not subject to federal regulation by the FAA. It's just outside the scope of what their statutory mandate is. So states are free to regulate UAS use with respect to warrant requirements. They're free to prohibit the use of drones to stalk people or invade people's privacy. They're free to prohibit use in aid of hunting or to harass hunters, and New Hampshire already has regulations, has a statute and a regulation that relate to both of those topics, and they'll come later in these materials. And they're also free to prohibit anyone from attaching a weapon to a drone. How things stand currently in New Hampshire law is there is no statute at this moment relating to drones. Neil Kirk, the chair of the House Finance Committee, has been sponsoring a bill since at least 2015. The most recent form of it was House Bill 97, which was just recently killed in the Senate as inexpedient to legislate. So New Hampshire at this point does not have any statutory law specifically directed to the use of drones. That doesn't mean that it's completely the Wild West out there. There are a number of existing statutes and a number of existing legal principles that still apply to the use of drones, and that's basically what we're going to talk about next. This is the statute and regulation I was alluding to with respect to hunting and fishing. RSA 207:57 specifically prohibits drone surveillance of people lawfully engaged in hunting, fishing, or trapping. The hunting, fishing, and trapping are obviously very big business in New Hampshire, and so we don't want folks engaging in these activities to be unduly harassed. At the same time, Fish and Game has a regulation that prohibits the use of a drone to help to locate wildlife for the purpose of taking it. So if you want to hunt, you got to do it the old-fashioned way, finding a good place to stake out. House Bill 97, if it was to become law, and it may return in some other guise in the future, will prohibit all government use. Let me just stop and say it is primarily directed to government use of this technology. So it would prohibit all government use of a drone except with a warrant or subject to a recognized exception to the warrant requirement, exigent circumstances or whatever other warrant requirement requirement exceptions may exist. I'm not an expert in criminal law. When swift action is needed to prevent imminent danger to life or serious damage to property, or to prevent the imminent escape of a suspect, or with the consent of the person or persons being surveilled. It would make the government strictly liable, whatever the government entity is, strictly liable for personal injury or property damage caused by a drone. Private use of a drone that conducts surveillance would be prohibited, except with the permission of the person surveilled and the owners of any structures. Which gets to the question of what do they mean by surveillance, which is, I don't have the statutory definition right at hand, but since it hasn't become law yet, I'm not sure how that's going to shake out, but that's something to keep an eye on if this statute or something similar to it becomes law. And the bill states that it is construed to give maximum protection to privacy. If that statute were to become law, it would make a government employee, agent, or contractor who violates the statute guilty of a Class A misdemeanor, and the government entity subject to a $10,000 fine to be paid into the general fund. And a private person injured through a government's negligent use of a drone could file suit, recover at least $1,000, plus other forms of damages and their attorney's fees. I want to stop and talk a minute about the Maine statute. I gave a seminar on drone law, as part of a seminar on drone law in Portland, Maine, 2 or 3 weeks ago. Maine is, in my personal opinion, further along down the road. That they enacted a drone statute in 2015. Attending the seminar was the chief pilot of the Maine State Police and the gentleman in charge of the drone program there. And Maine has a very similar requirement with respect to law enforcement using a drone only with a warrant or with another form of probable cause or in emergency situations. It doesn't have the penalties for unlawful use by government entities, and they have instead, the Maine State Legislature has instead directed their state police or Department of Safety to develop regulations subject to 15 or 16 specific criteria. From speaking to the gentlemen who were there from the Maine State Police, they have been working busily on those regulations for the past 18 months. Currently, they only use them for accident reconstruction because they can accomplish, they can get all the information they need from accident scenes much more quickly and efficiently using a drone than they can by shutting down the road for several hours and bringing in essentially a survey crew and mapping out the scene that way. So they found that it saves them a tremendous amount of time and effort, and they get a highly, highly accurate product by analyzing the digital images that they obtain through the drones. That, in my opinion, if there are law enforcement folks out there, if you have contact with the Maine State Police, that would be, I would suggest it would be a good place to start, because they are, again, I believe farther down the road than, to my knowledge, New Hampshire is with respect to law enforcement use of these things. Anyway, circling back to the current state of New Hampshire law, New Hampshire has privacy statutes on the books already. RSA 644-9 prohibits the use of a device to observe, photograph, or record the images of the private parts of any person in any private place or outside of any private place where they would not ordinarily be visible. So that's kind of the peeping Tom statute. There's also a statute that prohibits intercepting or recording communications, as verbal communications, without the consent of all parties. It's RSA Chapter 570A. And drones, of course, can be equipped with a microphone just as easily as they can be equipped with a camera. New Hampshire also has a common law, judge-made law of privacy that breaks down into 4 basic categories of intrusion upon seclusion, public disclosure of private facts, false site publicity, and appropriation of name or image. And it's really the first and the fourth that appear to relate specifically to drone use. Of course, if somebody takes your image and posts it on Facebook, the others can be implicated as well. Those principles of privacy really originate in a New Hampshire case. New Hampshire's Supreme Court was a leader in this area in the mid-1960s. Privacy has always been a significant value in New Hampshire. The Chief Justice of the New Hampshire Supreme Court in 1964 wrote that no right deserves greater protection than the right to solitude and seclusion as a safeguard of mediocrity and the stern friend of genius.
Good quote.
Those of us who are mediocre appreciate that. New Hampshire also has a common law of trespass in addition to a statutory criminal law of trespass. Trespass is an intentional entry into someone else's property that substantially interferes with the other person's use and enjoyment. So if the neighbor kid throws a ball into your property and runs over and grabs the ball and runs back to his yard, that's probably not a trespass, because is he really substantially interfering with your ability to use your property? And you're also probably, I would discourage you from shooting him or threatening him if he does that. So the question is, in the context of a drone, is somebody operating a drone that may be over your property substantially interfering with your use and enjoyment? The answer is, it depends. And if the answer wasn't it depends, then Margaret and I wouldn't have jobs.
Good point, Chris. And here is the question that so many of us want to know: can we shoot down the drone flying over our property?
Yeah. Federal law is very, very clear, and the FAA's view is very, very clear that they don't want anybody flying or shooting at flying objects full stop, because they are primarily concerned with ensuring the safety of manned aircraft. There was a difference of opinion, in the interest of full disclosure, there was a difference of opinion among the people who attended the seminar I was at Portland a few weeks ago. New Hampshire law says you can use reasonable force in the defense of yourself and your property. If you're in a position where you perceive a threat on account of a drone or anybody or anything else, a threat to your person or your property, you can use reasonable means to defend yourself and your property. What is reasonable force and what's reasonable under the circumstances? That's what 12 people on a jury are going to have to decide at the end of the day. I don't have a hard and fast answer to that. I would remind folks that we have a separate statute that prohibits the discharge of firearms within 300 feet of a residential structure other than your own.
Right.
So keep that in mind as well. There's a well-known case of a fella in Kentucky, and this has been litigated. This case just seems to linger on in the court system. A guy in Kentucky shot down a drone he claimed was hovering over his property where his teenage daughter was sunbathing. There was evidence the drone was flying below tree level, and that the same thing had occurred, I think 6 times over the previous year. He was charged with disturbing the peace, I believe, and the court dismissed the charges against him, finding that what he did was reasonable under the circumstances, and that the state couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt his intent to disturb the peace. There was a couple of civil lawsuits growing out of that as well, because the fellow who lost the drone sued to get his money back. And I don't know precisely how they came out, although I think he was unsuccessful. a similar situation in New Jersey. There was a fella operating a drone. This was in more of a neighborhood setting rather than a rural setting. A fellow was operating a drone to take pictures of his own house that was having some work done on it. I don't know if they were putting a roof on it or something. And one of his neighbors came out with a rifle and shot it down. And that gentleman was charged with, I think, again, disturbing the peace, and I think he was convicted of that particular crime. Totally different setting.
I have a question that's come up here from one of our attendees, Chris. It says, if the view from the public right-of-way is obstructed by trees or some other obstructions, can you use a drone to get above the screening, to get above the obstructions, without encroaching on the property?
That's a good question. I think the answer, well, again, this isn't formal legal advice, but my instinct is that that's okay, because you could climb a ladder, you could climb a tree.
And as long as you're on the, you're not on their private property, you're doing it from...
You're not trespassing.
Right.
You're not creating a nuisance, and we'll talk about nuisance in a second. You're not using a telephoto lens to get a view in their window. You're taking a view that would just, what you would ordinarily be able to see if you had a ladder, or if you could climb a tree.
Or if you were a much taller person.
Or if you were a significantly taller person. My instinct is that that's probably okay, and again, please don't hold me to that. I think of things like Google Street View, where Google has basically taken high-definition images of many, if not most, neighborhoods, houses, structures, buildings in the United States, and has posted that online for anyone to see.
Right.
It's hard for me to think of a principal difference between what Google is doing from the street and what the questioner is suggesting can be done with a drone. That sounds like a tax assessor type question.
One more question here, and this is a liability type question, Chris, if you wish to opine. What exposure does a municipality have if they allow recreational use of drones in a public park or a beach, and the drone causes injury to others or damage to private property?
I don't know if it's within the town's. First, I'm going to dodge the question by saying I don't know if it's within the town's jurisdiction to prohibit or regulate the use of the things for recreational purposes, except in the possible instance of in the vicinity of a school or some other kind of critical infrastructure. I don't know how that would be different than, I mean, permitting a private person to do it.
I think it would tie into the statutes that provide immunity to municipalities, with the exception that there could be liability for injuries caused by the ownership, maintenance, control of property, or by other negligence that's caused by the municipality or the municipal officials. And I'm not sure that simply allowing someone or someone else causing an injury on property would implicate liability for the municipality under those circumstances.
I mean, you and Margaret is a municipal law expert. You maintain roads and streets that are town property. If somebody steps in a pothole on a town street, is the town liable? I don't know.
Well, and that ties into very specific statutes that make towns and cities not liable unless they do or don't do a variety of things with regard to a known defect or insufficiency in the road. And so this is a very good question that would just require a closer look at the liability immunity statutes and whether that could create a liability for a municipality.
Yeah, that's something Margaret's far more conversant in than me. I have a hard time though just saying something happens in the town that the town has no direct control over. Are they permitting it to happen?
Generally just permitting or just saying that something is allowed or someone else conducting an activity would not implicate liability for the municipality.
Right. If you issue a permit, a building permit, and somebody gets hurt on the job, the town's not liable for that.
Absolutely not.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about the common law of privacy and a couple of privacy statutes. The common law of nuisance. The difference between nuisance and trespass is trespass involves a physical entry of some kind, and a nuisance does not necessarily require a physical entry onto your property. And there's an example of that coming up here. So a nuisance is any activity that substantially and unreasonably interferes with the use and enjoyment of somebody else's land, and no physical entry is required. So if your neighbor decides to start burning his trash or keeping pigs on his property next to you, and there's no physical intrusion onto your property, but it's the odors or whatever and the smoke from the activity is bothersome to you, that's where the law of nuisance could very well come into it, leaving aside zoning and all the other things that may apply. So here's an example. This is a New Hampshire case, Ferguson versus City of Keene. Mrs. Ferguson lived next to the Keene Municipal Airport. Airplanes used a warm-up apron within 700 feet of her house. That activity raised a lot of dust, made it impossible for her to carry on conversations. She claimed broke windows in her property, and she sued the City of Keene both for a taking of her property and for a nuisance. The court dismissed the taking claim because there was no overflight of her property, but permitted the nuisance claim to go forward for trial and further resolution. That's a classic example of a nuisance. I don't know how it turned out at the end of the day. They just said that the lawsuit could go ahead. So this is where the interest in this field really increased for many of my clients. Up until last year, I believe, 2016, 2015, anyway, in the recent past, prior to that time, in order to operate a drone commercially, you had to have a pilot's license, which really made it difficult to have widespread commercial use of this technology. And the purpose of the pilot's license was just to make sure that the operator was familiar with the rules of operating in the public airspace. Under direction from Congress, the FAA loosened up those regulations, and now it's much easier to operate these things commercially. You just take what I understand to be a quite difficult, actually, competency knowledge-based test. I would guess similar to, but more challenging than the test to get a boating license in New Hampshire. But they eliminated the requirement to have a licensed pilot operating these things. So as the use of the technology develops and as insurance policies are developing in this area, for many of my clients, they simply subcontract the services to an entity that has the required permits and licenses and carries the appropriate insurance. Talking to people in the insurance industry, the carriers are trying to figure out how to write this risk because they don't truly understand it. There's not a great deal of experience that they can base their risk assessment on. There is drone insurance out there. I hear it advertised on the radio. But at the time I originally put these slides together, the sort of general liability or more commonly available insurance was not yet fully developed, and people were going to specialty aviation carriers. That has changed now. Oops. So what does the future hold? I think you're going to see increasing uses of these things in your cities and towns for commercial purposes. I think it's going to, aside from uses that you yourself may want to make of them for your planning and zoning purposes, for your public safety purposes, for public works purposes, I think you're going to see real estate agents using them in and around your town. I think you're going to see surveyors and engineers starting to use them. And I think you're going to see over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, because this is just how the law works, the regulation will become increasingly further developed. The courts will be weighing in on the limits of what cities and towns can and can't do vis-a-vis the FAA jurisdiction over this airspace. I'm sure that with the increasing use of these things around, you're going to be seeing pressure from your constituents to develop regulations, particularly to keep your schools safe and to keep your critical infrastructure safe. And I think the FAA in general is going to be okay with that. I would suggest that you take them up on their request, that you'd simply give them a call, shoot them an email, tell them what you have in mind so you can avoid any problems before they develop.
And so, Chris, is sort of a wrap up. There's currently no state law directly addressing drones.
There's no state statute.
State statute. There are a number of other statutes, though, that certainly regulate drone behavior and other types of behavior, like privacy laws and trespassing laws. And that also that the FAA is willing, at least thus far, to review potential policies and to provide assistance to municipalities that want to try to enact policies and want to regulate drones in this area.
Yeah.
We do also have a few questions up here if you'd like to take a stab. The first question we have is, what about the airspace above a public road? Are there any height restrictions? Views on use of the UAV for infrastructure inspection and design and for damage assessment?
I think all those, if the question is, are those uses permissible, I would say yes, particularly if it's operated in a range of, to be very conservative, of 400 feet or less.
A second question we have up here, are New Hampshire cities and towns allowed to establish UAV restrictions? If so, is there a comprehensive list of municipalities that currently have regulations enacted?
I think they are, in principle, allowed to establish restrictions along the lines that are outlined in the fact sheet, particularly with respect to not being permitted to operate over critical parts of your infrastructure, schools, correctional facilities, public your wastewater treatment plant, your water treatment plant, your power plants, things of that nature.
And I do believe that the city of Dover has established a drone policy or drone use policy, although it may be more targeted at city use of drones than it is on other restrictions of use of drones.
I mean, I would love to see a list of municipalities that have adopted regulations and what they are.
And so if municipalities are making progress on developing policies, NHMA would be very interested in seeing what is going on in this area. One final question that we have up here, can you speak to the treatment of video-only recordings made from a UAS? Are they considered governmental records subject to right to know? How long do they need to be kept for, etc.?
That's an excellent question. I would suggest, and Margaret is more the expert on the right to know law than I am, but I'm going to suggest, subject to her correction, that if you as a municipality are shooting these videos, that they are a public record.
Yeah, if you, anytime a municipality is creating a ascertainable physical document or record of some sort, whether it's paper, whether it's on a computer, whether it's a voice recording or an audio recording, when it's done for an official purpose, when it's done by the municipality for the purposes for which a municipality functions, you are creating a governmental record. Regarding retention of that particular recording, regarding disclosure and any exemptions that may apply for disclosure, all of that's going to depend specifically on what is the recording, what is the record, what is it of, do any exemptions apply, and does the records retention statute address how long that record needs to be kept. So as a blanket question, I can't give specific answers, but I certainly know that you're creating a governmental record by creating a recording of that sort.
One of the things to branch off from that topic a little bit, in my capacity as the chair of the ZBA in Newmarket, we've talked about including in our public notices to abutters and things that we may use a drone to take pictures of the property, because it's helpful evidence of whether whether the subject property is similar or dissimilar to other properties in the area, right, which is one of the criteria that has to be established. So we're going to give people plenty of notice, you know, so we don't irritate people unduly by doing that. One of the big questions we haven't had a chance to address here is specifically law enforcement use of this technology and what police can and can't do with these things. I don't have a hard and fast answer to that, except that to be conscious, as police always are, of the requirements of probable cause and obtaining a warrant and those kinds of things. If the statute, one of the things I left out of the discussion of the proposed statute that has not yet become law, is there are all kinds of requirements for police retention of video evidence they obtain through drones that does not relate to the subject of their investigation. It has to be blurred out and has all kinds of special record keeping and reporting requirements that go along with that. That's something to keep in mind. And I would suggest again for any law enforcement folks out there, I think it'd be helpful to reach out to the state of Maine, the Maine State Police, take a look at their statute and talk to them about the regulations they're developing and the uses they're making of this technology.
Excellent. Well, seeing no further questions, I want to thank you again, Chris, for being here with us and doing this webinar on drone regulation. And thank you to all of you for attending. I hope this was helpful and interesting. And assuming that I have successfully followed Tim Fortier's directions and recorded this webinar for you, you will be receiving an email next week. We can send that follow-up contact information that Chris provided, as well as let you know that the recording is ready for you to listen to or to share with others. Just some coming attractions, things we have coming up here at NHMA. We have on July 18th another webinar, First Step in Getting Ready for the 2020 Census. I hope also that you will join us on August 16th, join Scott Myers and me for a webinar on running effective public meetings in August. Finally, just a few things to let you know. We have a brand new book, New Hampshire's Right to Know Law. NHMA has finally written a comprehensive book on the right to know law. We have a workshop coming up in September, and the book is also available for sale separately. And of course, our fall law lecture series are coming up, and here's the flyer for the dates, September 23rd and October 14th, 2 separate all-day events with 3 different lectures for anyone involved in the land use board world. And finally, our budget and finance workshops. Here are the dates as well for that full all-day workshop on budget and finance in September. And really finally, we have an advertisement for our annual conference, and we hope to see you there in November 15th and 16th in Manchester. Again, thank you so much for being with us. Look out for that email next week. Enjoy your day, and I hope you're all having enjoyable summers. Thank you.
Thank you.